the floor is hereby open. Barry, and when people say their names,
I'm Barry Bluestone.
thank you, Barry.
Gary, I think I'd like to ask you this question. I can understand, particularly what we're talking about here, where you do not want to have perfect evidence of everybody's DNA. But in the medical field, and I happen to be personally involved in a case right now where I'm glad we have genetic screening for HER2, are there times when ignorance is bliss? Let's think about prostate cancer. Is it sometimes better not to test? And ultimately also, is ignorance bliss is the main question. Are there times when we may be thinking about, this model of everybody getting a full genetic scan, and whether that's the kind of thing we ultimately want to do, or is there a problem there?
I think you're asking both the right questions. First, I think that ignorance is bliss at times, and the question, I guess, as a physician and as a psychiatrist in particular, the focus of treatment in uncertain circumstances, what is accurate empathy? How can one accurately be empathic to the circumstance someone has? So, finding a Herceptin marker, an overexpression of Herceptin, to be able to use a specific intervention, or to use Herceptin in a specific person with breast cancer, is in fact being empathic and being more accurate than one would if one would essentially treat somebody without that knowledge and not know what to do. On the other hand, I am a geriatric psychiatrist, and I've taken care of few thousand people with dementia, the Alzheimer's type, and our ability to slow that process, and frankly, the ability to add more certainty than a clinical diagnosis and a study, and an excellent history and a set of clinical studies to rule out other things that might be confusing the diagnosis, is pretty small. The specificity of the clinical evaluation and its correlation with postmortem findings is very, very high. It's higher than most other diagnoses. The notion that somebody would think of themselves in being at risk, if I have no approaches that can prevent any kind of intervention, would be, to seem to me to be unempathic, and would not offer incremental value in terms of being able to manage that finding. On the other hand, might I want to tell a person who, if there was a locus that was associated with Alzheimer's disease, not to become a boxer, if there's evidence that dementia pugilistica predisposes essentially to the evolutionary neuropathology associated with Alzheimer's disease, well, that might be a reason in which I would want to do that. And so the second piece, the notion of having a fully mapped genome, I'm not sure what value it adds from a medical perspective. The value to us at the moment is in science, and that is be able to take phenotypic data on large cohort samples and be able to put them together to understand what it was that might have increased the risk that this group of people who we knew or we know are still alive might have ended up with a specific outcome with a higher degree of certainty than just evaluating those risks over time. And that's where some of the interesting component of the science is. But in the same way that I'm not certain, there are arguments about having complete diagnostic assessments of people who are healthy to determine whether they're at risk without knowing anything else, like doing full body CAT scans, which actually have some risk when you do them frequently. It raises a very substantial set of similar questions.
I am in the rare position of being one of the few human beings who's about to have their full genome sequenced. My new series is, I'm doing 2 Asian Americans, 2 Jewish Americans, 2 Arab Americans, 2 Latino Americans, 2 West Indian Americans, and a Native American. We're doing Yo-Yo Ma, we're doing Eva Longoria, we're doing Meryl Streep and Mike Nichols, et cetera. So, it was good for black people, why not do it for everybody, right? But we decided to ratchet up the DNA component, big time. And so we negotiated this deal. 6 months ago, it cost $300,000 to have your genome sequenced. Now you can get it done for $99,000. We worked out a deal. I'm not allowed to say what we did, but it's an incredible deal. And this company that sequences agreed to sequence 2 full genomes. I mean, even the Personal Genome Project is not sequencing full genomes. There's 6 billion base pairs in your genome. You get half of them from your mother, half from your father. Personal Genome Project is doing 30 million, which is it's very important, but it's still tiny. I will have to decide whether, and there's considerable pressure from friends like George Church and people, to whether to make that public. But I've gotten around it by, remember I told you they'd agreed to do 2. So we kept arguing, do you want Eva Longoria? Would she agree? You know, you want somebody sexy to make it sexy for TV. We decided to do the sexiest person of all my life, who's my father. This will be the first time a person that old's ever had their genome sequenced. He'll be 96 on June 8th. We're going to make it public. He said, what the hell do I care? Right? I mean, if he has the gene for Alzheimer's.
That's ancient DNA by definition.
Yeah, right. And in a way, you get half of me, not really, but you know. And I am, it'll be the first father and son, the first African Americans, and we will make my father's public by his wish, and mine, I don't think so. And I do not want to know if I have the gene, like James Watson,
Right.
for Alzheimer's. I'm not interested in knowing that.
Thank you. I think I saw your hand and then Chris's. Yeah. You're going to have to stand up and really project and say who you are.
Susan Satter, Philosophy and Religion. Thank you. I'm thinking back to the XYY chromosome problem of maybe 35, 40 years ago. Are people familiar with that? The study that they studied all people in prison and decided that people who had XYY chromosomes were more prone to crime. However, if they did eye color on the same people in the same population, they would have found that people with that eye color would be more prone to crime because they were studying prisoners. And so my question is, in the DNA, when you're talking about studying people with, and I guess this would be an argument for wholesale testing of lots of people, because in the example with Alzheimer's, what you're going to find is that all the people you test have the gene for Alzheimer's, and is that, or is there some?
It's not true.
Thank you, Susan. Whoever wants to respond?
I'd like to respond to that both directly and indirectly. First of all, it's not true that there is a gene for Alzheimer's. There are many genes contributing to slightly increased risk. I mean, one of the things, this was just in the New England Journal of Medicine about a few weeks ago, that there are these genome-wide association studies that are trying to pull out all of the factors that contribute to a particular disease in the hope that you'd pull out, and this is sort of a blind scanning, that you'd pull out 3 or 4 that were fairly large contributors. I mean, once you get to something like Alzheimer's or heart disease, the genetic components of them, the ingredients list, there are many of them. But what's turned out so far in these genome-wide scans is that there is no handful of larger contributors, but lots and lots of tiny little incremental contributors. One of the letters to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine about this article said, if you do the same study for height, you end up finding that almost every gene in the genome contributes to height, or to variance in height, actually. So you can't work backwards right now in that way. And this is partly, so the BRCA genes for breast cancer are another really interesting example, because they tell us about heritability of cancer in about 10% of the known breast cancers, and the other 90% have unknown causes, many of which are probably due to varieties of environmental insults. And again, I'm going to go back to the recipe. They have to have happened in the right order, in the right sequence, with certain ingredients. There are probably other genes involved as well. So one of my worries about this is not that there aren't interesting things to know about the BRCA genes and for the population that has them in terms of risk, but what happens in terms of our investigatory interest and input into understanding the other 90% of causes. So, and the same thing for any of these other multifaceted or multi-caused diseases, Alzheimer's, heart disease, they all have, except for the extreme cases, many genes contributing to them. And many environments contributing to them, and what we need to know really is how those work together. What order do they have to happen in? When do genes get expressed? What, a whole developmental sequence is what we need to understand. So as long as we categorize it in terms of genes for, rather than the development of a recipe, I think we miss an incredible amount, the bulk of what we really want to know better.
Carla, could I add to that as well?
Yeah,
Because-
Carla, and then Peter, try to keep them short so we can get in a couple more questions.
Okay, let me just say, I agree with everything that Anna said. The other thing that happens when we have, both environmental factors as well as endogenous factors in terms of whether or not a disease expresses itself is that, as a quick example, is I think black women die of breast cancer. There's excess mortality at a higher rate than, say, white women. So is this a genetic factor? But we've also found that there are some studies that show that the therapies suggested for black women are less aggressive than those suggested for white women. And you can do that by zip codes, you can do it by education. So are they dying because their cancers are more aggressive, or are they dying because physicians are making judgments that give them less aggressive treatment for their cancers? As long as we say that it's the genetics that we're interested in, we sort of push aside those environmental as well as social factors that would give us significant information about how we treat patients, not just what patients bring to us.
Absolutely.
Peter, Chris, you had a question.
Chris Basso, Political Science.
Loudly.
Chris Basso, Political Science.
There's a mic.
I'm intrigued by what's going to be the normative discourse in the sense of, in our history in the United States in particular, we've typically categorized certain behaviors based on a moral or even criminal sort of dimension, alcoholism, drug abuse, et cetera, a lot of other kinds of behaviors. And now the discourse on genetic predisposition of certain behaviors was going to really scramble that discourse, I suspect. And I want you to know if you want to comment on that, how this shapes the discourse in terms of our classic understanding of what we believe to be free will, and what we believe to be behavior, predisposition, et cetera. How do you think it's going to scramble that a bit?
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of people think that information itself is neutral. Okay? Whatever it is, and it's always good to have more information. The reality is, and I'm not being some kind of Luddite here as opposed to science and technology, because I'm in favor of it, but we should do with our eyes wide open, understanding that people do exploit knowledge in all kinds of venomous ways. Okay? Just to give you a simple illustration, there was a bill introduced in Congress a couple of years ago to create a special DNA database of all the people who have been convicted of sexual assaults, and particularly pedophilia. And the goal was that they wanted to study those people to see what they could learn. And who knows what they'll learn? Who knows, for instance, if you do multifactorial analysis for addiction, for violence-prone behavior, for whatever, you may find something, or you will find something, okay? Well, what do you do with it? Okay, will the state then intervene and try and modify the people who have a predisposition genetically for certain behavior? Will children be removed and given retooling to make it less likely that they'll do something when they reach adolescence? Who knows? One of the things I can tell you in the most immediate sense, which happened with something called functional MRIs, which is a very hot button item right now in criminal justice. And on the one hand, defense attorneys wanted to introduce these functional MRIs to suggest, hey, it's not a product of free will. I killed this person because I have an organic, factor which made me do it. On the other hand, prosecutors are looking at the fMRI and saying, hey, this guy is going to be a recidivist. We should execute him because there's no likelihood that he'll be rehabilitated because he has an organic issue. I can tell you that ultimately, the side that will prevail, I believe, in the exploitation of those things, given the historical record, will be the prosecutors who want to use it for the latter category, and that we as a society should be very mindful for any of these issues about not just the knowledge that is adduced, but also how it gets utilized later on.
Oh, sorry. Well, and this issue affects, is an area of grave concern to me as an African-American in the realm of intelligence. Now, I did the first interview with James Watson, who I would say is a friend of mine, after he got fired for basically saying, racist things and sexist things.
You only got fired for the racist.
The racist things, right. But he got the sexist thing. Right. But you all know James Watson. He was the person who identified the double helix, Watson and Crick. We all know that, right? So I interviewed him, and I gave him a chance to And basically, we talked for an hour and a half. We had a film crew. He had his PR guy there. We went to Cold Spring Harbor. In the first hour, he was fine. In the last 30 minutes, he got really comfortable. And he said, I don't know what you complained about. It was a Monday. He said, you guys dominate us in basketball. I watch basketball all day long, and you're so much better genetically than we are. So what if the Jews are smarter intellectually than black people are? I mean, it's all in the interview, right? You can watch it on the internet. And I wrote an essay about it, and I said, for as much as I love this science and been thrust into this world, sooner or later, we're going to go back to pseudoscience of the 18th century, and we're very close, and somebody's going to announce in Cold Spring Harbor, someplace else, that Jews are smarter than black people because of genetics, and you can forget all those trillions of dollars that people want to spend for Head Start and all those interventionist programs, because it doesn't matter. These people are genetically inferior. Save the money and send them to vocational school or something. And that's what terrifies me.
Gary, Gary had a response too.
I mean, I think a critical point here, a consistent one, is that what is one small part of an assessment of any problem? And to overgeneralize, I mean, except in that in who didn't do a rape, in the way that you were describing it, and to assess any of these issues in the context of that single factor would be to be missing the overall picture of these, particularly as it relates to health, but also as it relates to the kinds of conditions you described. I mean, the functional imaging, that could be a syllogism. Somebody's functional MRI could in fact be so-called abnormal because they did the crime, not because it caused them to do the crime. It could be a state issue and not a trade issue in the way that functional MRI works, just as an example. As you were describing the so-called science of association studies, the whole discipline we've had about science is generating hypotheses and then testing the hypotheses, not finding the hypotheses from the database. And that's the real danger of associational science, is that basically we have this tool now, and the tool is so compelling that in some ways we want to use it, and then essentially we want to reason from the predicate in terms of what it is that we found.
Can I just respond to one little thing, Carla? That's all well and good in science, in truth, but unfortunately, policy is not necessarily determined by science. In fact, if you looked at the National Academy of Science report, which just came out last month, talking about forensic science in America, all these people were aghast to realize for the first time that many of the forensic disciplines, other than DNA, never had any scientific foundation for them, had never gone through validation or reliability studies. And what I worry about, when a politician makes the statement offhandedly a couple of weeks ago, it's not in this nation's DNA to do whatever, okay? But people go, oh yeah, that's cool, and people think about, wow, I can find everything out about where my great-great-great-grandparents are from. Oh wow, I can decide, once I do this other test, what to eat, what not to eat, what games to play, what not to play. And the fact is even though you've all re-educated us, okay, about what's fact and what's fiction, most people are still going to go with the fiction because it's a good story.
It is a good story.
And
it's got to be careful.
But you can't stop the progress of science. The idea, if the one thing that you cannot leave this room believing that all these caveats are going to stop the sequencing of genomes, and it's just going to happen. What we have to do is figure out how to do it responsibly, how to build safeguards. But you cannot stop it. The genie's out of the bottle. You can forget that.
Well, when they mapped the genome, and this better than I do, is that 7 cents in every dollar of federal funding was supposed to go not for the actual scientific research, but was to go to deal with the social, legal, and ethical implications of mapping the genome. And, there was something there, but there wasn't enough there.
Well,
We need your help in that regard because we've
Exactly.
siloed off
Exactly.
sets of thinking from one another. I mean, that was
Right,
the idea
exactly.
of the cell laws, to bring
Right.
it back together.
That's
Right.
right.
Look, I'll give you a personal guilt. I was at Penn when we recruited and put together a gene therapy program. And that gene therapy program came with the hiring of a well-known ethicist as part of the program. And it was the first program in which a clinical trial caused the unfortunate death of somebody with cystic fibrosis. And essentially, the university, the investigator, and the dean of the medical school had a conflict related to the IP, the intellectual property, related to creating the gene therapy. So having those silos, even together in the same lab, in the same program, were unable to allow us to safeguard our own behavior.
Fascinating.
This is probably, I mean, it's really unfortunate. It's a little after 8. I promised the panel we'd end at 8. It's the moment of sort of putting it back on us from Gary Gottlieb is probably just the moment to seize and to say this is one of what need to be many conversations about how do we do that? What are the institutions by which we do that? The Human Genome Project had the 3 to 5% through ELSI. ELSI doesn't even exist anymore. In the new institute, there's no 3 to 5%. There is no ELSI. There are ELSI-type projects. That was a one-off. It was the only time the federal government had ever funded that kind of ethical and social research, and it turned out to be a one-off. So where do we go? If we want in on this conversation, if we want to know that the kinds of people seated at this panel are going to be in on this conversation, I'm afraid we're going to have to figure out how to make that happen. Because they may not come to us, I mean, unless they're outside, maybe they're here. But I don't know if they're going to come to us and say, great, you're the commission. So I just want to thank again this panel for giving us a vision of what real interdisciplinary conversation is. And thank you all so much.